Thank you all for coming, fighting the snow. We were just commenting that we're surprised Hannah didn't have shorts on. She's in her element now with a little snow coming in. It's my pleasure to introduce, someone who I think most of you know, Grant Saunders. I neglectfully didn't put his credentials on his flyer announcement, so he is a chiropractor as well. And a little background, he graduated from Baldwin Wallace College in exercise science, that's in Cleveland, Ohio, and then went to upstate New York, to New York Chiropractic College, and received his degree there. He's currently an exercise physiology doctoral student here at the University of Kentucky, and teaches a number of classes as well for us. In fact, I'm passing around the roster. Please, if you're in the 445 class, if you would sign the guest roster for me, that would be helpful. I also have a little apology to Grant. We had a cancellation, and I went down literally probably a day and a half, 2 days ago, and said, Grant, can you help us out? Can you fill in? So I'm sorry I got the announcement late to you all. And thank you to Grant for putting his presentation together on short notice. And without further ado, I'll let you introduce your title.
All right, so this is my first experiment toward my doctorate. I got to do 3. This is the first one. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, if there wasn't much choice involved. So here's where we're going today. Typical elements of a research experiment. And we'll end up with what's going to happen for number 2, because I'm writing a proposal for that right now. So just to start out, how many people in here have been to a chiropractor? All right, a good number. Now, aside from musculoskeletal complaints, how many went mainly for the purpose of improving their athletic performance? One person, 2 people? Okay. Well, other folks who do that are professional athletes. And not just within the NFL or the NBA, but beyond that, the Olympics. The past several decades, there have been multiple chiropractors at the Olympics as an essential part of the healthcare delivery team. In fact, there is Usain Bolt getting an adjustment with the activities. And then there's a woman from the women's wrestling team. So, despite the anecdotal evidence that chiropractic works for athletic performance, improving performance, keeping in the game with rehab aspects, there isn't a lot of scientific evidence backing this assertion up. And that's why I'm here. I want to help improve the situation. What has been done as far as athletic performance, I'm looking at strength. And the studies that have been done, they looked at isometric contractions and have found that there is a time effect where a lot of them find significant increases in strength post-adjustment, but it does not last past 5 or 10 minutes. So these things kind of led me to how I set up my experiment, that I took baseline 5-minute and 20-minute measurements, and I thought the same thing would happen, that it would be a short-lived effect, and that we would get the peak torque generation with the same thing, isometric contractions. So what I did, had 21 subjects, and several of them here were in my study, thank you. College-aged, 20 to 35, and purposely recruited them to where they have never had chiropractic treatment before. And I'll explain that later. That played a part with the sham treatment. So my design was a randomized, controlled, single-blind crossover study. For you folks in 445, I'm not going to call you out, but I'm sure you're going through that. Everyone came in 3 times, and this was all in the biodynamics lab over in Wintergrad. So for the first visit, it was just the initial information, just the intake form, the IRB consent, and then a physical exam to rule out any contraindications to being adjusted. What the physical exam included, we had blood pressure, took range of motion, cervical, thoracic, lumbar spine, did a neurological evaluation, did muscle reflex sensory for 5th cervical nerve through the 1st thoracic and then with the lumbar spine. Then we did some reflexes, some orthopedic tests, And after all this, all the paperwork, once people were cleared, there's no reason not to render treatment, then went ahead and palpated, okay, are you restricted? Where is it? What are the restrictions? And then the last thing for the first session was a familiarization with the biodex. Got them in, got them strapped in, had their knee lined up with the axis of rotation, had them do a couple reps to get used to it. And what we did after that, the second and third sessions, we took the heat torques and what they did. We did 3 main contractions. We did isometric, and that was at 60 degrees of knee flexion. And then we did 2 speeds at isokinetic. We did 60 degrees per second and 180. The 180 is pretty quick. It's kind of like kicking a soccer ball almost. And it was always kind of a process getting people strapped up in the apparatus. I mean, you had two torso straps, you had seat belt, you had thigh strap, you had ankles. And it was always interesting at that first familiarization session, getting people strapped in and look at their expression, like, hey, are you going to test my strength, or is this more like a roller coaster? So, okay, then on the second and third sessions, again, we're measuring peak torque, and we looked at that for knee extension as well as flexion. So after a warm up on the cycloergometer, 5 to 10 minutes, they did a practice 5 reps at both speeds, just to get used to about 50%. And then for the 3 different contractions, isometric, we did 3 of flexion, 3 of extension for 5 seconds each, and then took the peak torque from all those. For the isokinetic at both speeds, again, it was flexion extension, so it was tore away, that's 1, tore away 2. Did 3 times at both speeds, and took the peak torque from all of those. And this was a repeated measures design, so every subject served as their own control. So that increases the reliability by decreasing the variability in responses between each subject, since it's the same one being tested. So I know I kind of gave you a lot of information, a lot of details. Let's summarize it here one more time. The first visit, again, is just the general informed consent, all that. Now here's where the testing was. The second and third visit, so baseline measurements, and then one of the 2 forms of treatment. It was the real adjustment or it was the sham. Within 5 minutes, tested again, weight 20, and then the third time. And then 3 days in between to account for any delayed onset muscle soreness. Did the exact same thing, only after the baseline measurement, if they did the sham, they did the adjustment, or vice versa. And then again, 5 to 20 minutes. And then how this all played out with collecting data, there was quite a bit of data. Here's how it all kind of went into the computer. You had, so here's your 3 with flexion extension for all of them, so there's 6. Baseline measurements, the top of the 3, the peak torques of the 3 for each. Right here would be the treatment, and then 520. Same thing the next day, baseline, treatment, 520. So in all total, when everyone was done, each subject had 36 peak torque values, comparing 16 to 16. And then the last thing here, it was randomized, and just kind of moving left to right, this is the sheet I used for every subject. And what I did, this was all the possible combinations of isometric and isokinetic testing, Q being quadriceps, H hamstrings. So let's say for the very first subject here, where it went over, this was a sequence of randomly generated numbers. So number 6, they would actually get this treatment first. This would be the protocol. And then going over for sham treatment, number 7, it's an odd number, so they would receive the adjustment first. And then the third session, they would have the sham treatment. So that's how that was all randomized and put together for all the subjects. All right, so now that we kind of covered the design, let's get into actually what the treatments were. So again, the importance, the lumbar adjustment, the whole reason for that is for the anatomical basis that for the quadriceps and hamstrings, the peripheral nerves that innervate those muscles, the femoral and sciatic nerves, arise from the ventral roots of L2 through S3. So by adjusting those segments, the theory is that if you restore biomechanical integrity of the joint complex, you'll have a better nervous connection with the muscle, possibly greater strength and contraction. So how we did this, I had this subject in side posture, and you isolate the segment to be adjusted, and what it was a slight body drop to where the line of drive went straight through the point of contact, and it's called a high velocity low amplitude adjustment. High velocity meaning you set it up, you get the pre-tension by moving the torso in the opposite direction. So it was very fast, but it was not deep. It was not low amplitude into the tissues. And this is pretty typical adjustment for what you see for chiropractors, for physical therapists, for osteopaths. And then for the sham treatment, it was, we used the table for this one, where you can kind of see there's a section of the table that raises up about 1/2 inch. You pull the lever here, and it comes up, and you set the tension for it. And you apply pressure, and the table comes down, and the gravity effect does the adjustment. So from right here, it's the same thing. It's the same line of drive, posterior to anterior, inferior to superior, medial to lateral. Only instead of being in side posture, patient's prone, and the table does the adjustment. Now, while this really is a method to adjust, especially sacroiliac joints, what I did for the sham, I just came off the spine, so I wasn't contacting any of the vertebrae or the PSIS. I was just off of it. But again, because I recruited people who had never been adjusted, they couldn't really tell the difference. And because I was doing this, the table was coming down each time, they figured, oh, that's another way, but it's just as equal an adjustment. So that's how we did both treatments. And after all that, we found no differences between the means. Despite the hypotheses, that's how research goes, but we'll get into how that actually sets me up for the next experiment. When looking at just the overall changes, looking at isometric, isokinetic, at both speeds, taking into account flexion, extension, all the time periods, the standard deviations they were all over the place. The closest one to approximate statistical significance was the isometric contractions. But the main reasons we were thinking why this happened, I'll get into later with the variability in strength testing. But looking more specifically at the results, if you were to take the same overall measurements that I showed you and divide it up into extension and flexion for all of them, here's how it came out. And again, standard deviations are all over the place, but the closest one, again, to approximate being significant was isokinetic flexion at 180 degrees, which oddly enough is probably the least reliable of all of them. So I mean, pulling it in really fast, that's not very reproducible compared to the other ones, but that's how it turned out. Here's the same layout at 5 minutes compared to baseline. And again, no significant effects. And what's interesting, here it is at 20 minutes, and that's how it all ended up. I know it's not funny, but I guess I can't really say that it's congruent with what's been found, that there was less of an effect at 20, because to do that you'd have to compare 5 and 20, but just kind of eyeballing it, if there wasn't much at 5, there really wasn't much at 20, so. That's how that all turned out. Now, okay, why did this happen? Well, if you take someone and you test their strength, there's a lot of variability in it. Different references I've found, some say as good as 5%, some say all the way up to 10 to 15. I mean, if you take someone and you have them push against a load cell as hard as they can, they get 100 newtons of torque. Same person, same day, do it again, push as hard as they can, the best you're going to get to approximate that 100 meters would be 95 or 105. So to overcome this 5 to 10% variation, the adjustment would have needed to instantaneously produce a 10% increase in strength. And I kind of knew that going in that wasn't likely, but we still tried. As far as I'm aware, there isn't much that could produce an instant 10% increase in strength unless you're in a life and death situation or amphetamine use, maybe both. But despite that, the attempts to maximize the internal validity, if subjects presented, if they had any soreness from the last treatment session or sports, we had them come back. Any caffeine ingestion within the past several hours, that wasn't allowed. And then to account for circadian rhythms and the effects of hormone variations and how that can impact the ability to produce a maximal contraction. Had them tested the same time of day. And of course, we used isokinetic dynamometry, which is shown to be the most reliable method. All right, so in all these other articles that did find different results, to my knowledge, there are 22 of them. 18 found significant increases. 3 of them like mine didn't, and 1 was just a case study. And what they did as far as strength, they had several different muscle groups. The main ones being quadriceps and grip strength. They did a lot of judo athletes and grip strength to correlate with that. Now again, why were mine so different? Well, if you look at what's been done, 10 of them, only 10 out of that 22 used a randomized control design. And within that 10, only 6 had the most reliable methods, an isokinetic dynamometer or a load cell. A lot of them were using a handheld force transducer, which is reliable, but in comparison to a biodex, it's just not nearly the same, especially if you're doing quadriceps. And if you get something really powerful, that's not quite the same. And that's how they were finding their significant results. In addition to that, if you look at the subjects that they used, 9 of them were from an asymptomatic population. And of those 9, there were 3, and those were the 3 that did not show the significant results. And again, I used an asymptomatic college-age population. And while I'm not especially well-versed in the rehab literature, what I kind of gleaned from their results was that for the symptomatic population, if you had knee pain or back pain, it afforded them a greater opportunity to show an effect size. I mean, if you reduce pain with the adjustment and you reduce muscle inhibition, there's a greater likelihood that they're going to show more results. In addition to that, another thing we had, there were studies looking at electromyography after an adjustment, and they had different studies looking at the activation with different isometric contractions, but what was the most interesting among all of these was actually they looked at resting activity, and post-adjustment they were getting all kinds of different results. Specifically with the symptomatic group, they were finding a lot of times that there was decreased activity after that. I mean, they took a person with muscle spasm and adjusted them and then put the electrodes on and looked at it again, there was decreased activity, showing an inhibitory effect. And then other studies, there was an increase. So why I would get an inhibitory effect for asymptomatic, I'm not sure yet, but studies are still trying to figure out exactly what's going on. But to do that, we're looking at central nervous system processing because, again, even though what I did wasn't enough to overcome that 10% variability, there are effects going on in the central nervous system. And getting into these physiological effects, it gets kind of deep, but of all the studies I'm looking at, pulling together what the explanations are, the 4 most common ones they talk about most often are stimulating mechanoreceptors. Again, if you have a joint complex, if you have a fixation, let's say in the lumbar spine, again, the theory is that the afferent information is not going to quite be able to be integrated into the central nervous system as if there was optimal alignment, optimal biomechanical integrity, especially when you think about the dorsal root ganglion that's being compressed. Theory, it's a really oversimplified way to think of it, but kind of like a garden hose. If you're compressing that, information is going to get in as well. And again, that's really simple when you get into neurology with the spinal thalamic tract and all the interneurons and synapses. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the main concept. In addition, getting away a little bit from strength and different athletic evaluations, talking about more for a clinical aspect. Why does it help people to feel better? Well, some of the main things that we're looking at were central facilitation. And again, spinal thalamic tract, for a pain to be registered, for a signal to be registered as pain, it has to reach the thalamus to be registered as such in the rest of the brain. And they found that with the adjustment, all the kind of checkpoints in the spinal cord and the brainstem before it gets to that point, the adjustment somehow helps with the afferent information to where those checkpoints are more efficient, and the nociceptive inputs aren't registered as much. So for some athletics, this could be a great thing. You think about wrestling or other activities like that, this could actually play a part apart from just increasing strength. And again, talking about biomechanical integrity, the pressures on the intervertebral disc between the vertebrae. Well, I'm talking all this anatomy. Has everyone had anatomy? I mean, you know, I'm talking about with the vertebrae and intervertebral disc. I mean, if you have a motion segment that's off, here, let me just draw this. Hands don't really work so well. Try to draw it. Okay, so let's just say this is a segment in your lumbar spine. You got both vertebrae, intervertebral disc. I didn't really show it in between, but now let's say you have a restriction to where you have, let's say, a left rotation, right lateral flexion restriction. So in relation to the one below it, the one up above, it's going to be turned more this way. The spinous process is turned, and it looks more like this. So we have an effect this way. Well, I know it's tough to see, I'm sorry.
Let's see if there's another panel here on the other side. Oh, there's a red one up there.
Anyway, the point being that this is kind of how research goes. There's always things you don't think about. The point being that if you have fixation in the motion segment, that's going to impact not just those vertebrae, but everything around it. You think about the intervertebral disc between that. You think about any kind of axial loading. If this is optimally aligned, it's going to be better able to withstand those compressive forces. But if you have one that's kind of stuck this way and not able to rotate as much, it's not going to be able to withstand those forces as well. And then all the supporting tissues, if you think about the musculature attaching to it, if this is pulled more this way, on one side of the spine it's doing this, and the other spine it's like this. That's how that all kind of goes, that it all works together. It's not just the vertebrae, it's everything surrounding it. And then how that would lead to a change in how afferent information is processed. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so getting toward the end here, limitations, as with any study, there are always several of them. Activities between sessions. Subjects denied being sore when they came in or doing a whole lot, but I mean, you know, people aren't just, they don't go home and think, okay, I gotta just do nothing until the next one. I mean, people are moving around, they're going to the gym. That was, of course, that could have affected the results. And then kind of going with that, the fitness levels. I had the full spectrum. It was interesting. On one hand, I had a student athlete and a bodybuilder. Bodybuilder was actually 2 weeks out of competition, and we scheduled it towards leg workouts. We tested him right before his next leg workout. But I mean, I had that on one side, and then the other side, I had someone who's almost sedentary. So that's going to affect their ability to recruit motor units to elicit a maximal contraction. Not only that, but the motivational aspect. To limit bias with this, I did not provide verbal encouragement while they were testing. So while they were doing isometric contraction, I mean, of course, especially after the adjustment, you want to say, come on, go, but I just was silent. I told them before each session, okay, this is a maximal contraction. And you can tell when you really look, there were several that truly gave it their all. And while everyone tried, there were some you just know they weren't going 100%, they're going 90, 95. So sometimes between sets, I would remind them, okay, it's as hard as you can. Didn't always make that much of a difference, but again, I had a good group, though everyone did try. I was really lucky with my subjects. I actually had a good time with some of them. In addition to that, even though the isokinetic dynamometer, even though it's the most reliable method, it's not free from error. If you set the subject up, I mean, the pad underneath, when they go to extend or flex, that's going to compress the pad. So even though they're lined up with that axis of rotation, it's still going to kind of come off that. So it's not truly the way you set it up to be with their knee. And then the ankle, when they go to press against the ankle, there's always a little bit of give in there before that comes up. So, I mean, the only way to truly isolate the thigh to measure extension and flexion, you'd have to plaster someone into there, or, you know, weld them in somehow to where you just have that. But since that wasn't feasible, and no one would want that, that introduced some error. So looking ahead at all the research, several improvements need to be made on the existing knowledge base. We need studies with a lot larger numbers. My goal was about 40, but we put the kibosh on it at 21. It was getting toward the end of the year, and we weren't really showing significant results, so the next one will do better. We need a group that's more homogeneous with physical as well as the mental capabilities. We need to take like a team of football players, or where everyone's pretty much on the same level, so there's less variability in the responses. And then if there was a way to control the environment with physical activity, I don't know what kind of grant would support living at another field house to just do research, but something like that, maybe even the military, they control that. And then what else I've been talking about, maximal contractions, isometric and isokinetic. Well, there really isn't anything done with regard to fatiguing contractions. Maybe get SY to add some beet juice to it, I don't know. But that needs to be an issue as well, to look at different muscle fibers and the effect on them. And then also been talking about open chain movements. Another thing would be to include closed chain movements. So in addition to just knee flexion extension, if you could get them going doing a squat, that might provide more information as well. So there are a lot of different avenues that need to be taken to expand this. It's only really begun during the past several decades, but this is what we still need to do. And not only that, talking about asymptomatic and symptomatic individuals, I'm only aware of one study that compared the difference between the two. And they looked at grip strength with judo athletes. And we just need more doing that, instead of saying, okay, as two different studies, we need to compare how did both do after the adjustment with, let's say, a fatiguing contraction or multi-joint movements. And then last thing here, for my second experiment, again, since overall force wasn't showing much, let's kind of bypass just the general force production and look more directly at the central nervous system. So, is anyone familiar with twitch interpolation? Okay, so basically, this is a setup for the gastroc soleus, and what you do, you have the subject doing a maximal contraction. So for this, they'd be plantar flexing as hard as they can into it, and you'd watch the newton meters of torque, how high that goes up. And once they kind of plateau, they're going as hard as they can, you elicit an electrical stimulus through here for the peripheral nerve innervating the muscle, you stimulate that, and that recruits all the motor units fully. And you measure the difference between what they were doing on their own and with that stimulus. So if they were getting 98 newton meters of torque and you stimulate them when they have 10, there's a difference of 2. What I want to know is if you adjust someone and then do this again, allowing for the training effect and those variables, if there would be a decrease in that deficit. If you adjust someone and they get 99.5 and then 100, there's a difference of 0.5 between 1.5. That could show that the effects in the central nervous system might be related to the ability to recruit more motor units and produce a more forceful contraction. So that's in the work right now. That's what I would do, either something similar to this, or for quadriceps hamstrings, stimulate the femoral nerve. But I'm doing the proposal, I'm putting it all together right now. It seems feasible. And even though it looks kind of serious with the shock, it's not like the electric tear or anything. It's just enough to get that nerve going to recruit all those motor units. So that's future directions. It's been an interesting ride. Got a lot to go yet. I'd like to thank all my subjects You were great, especially not being paid. My committee, everyone's been great, going to them for advice on different things, different input. They're always, they always reply back real quick to my emails. Everyone's been great in my committee. And of course, Dr. Yates for his patience, explaining things multiple times. But I'm very lucky with the people I work with. Here are all 46 of my references I did. If anyone's really interested, you can ask me, I'll give it to you. You don't have to read too fast. And that's basically it. Does anyone have any questions?
Did you happen to, off the top of your head, you said you had a very heterogeneous group of subjects, look at differences between people who engaged in some heavy spinal loading, like a bodybuilder or anybody who squats or deadlifts or things like that, versus people who didn't really have much spinal loading?
I didn't look at the differences. I was just pulling in everyone. That would be interesting to see the compression on the intervertebral disc and how that might affect through the dorsal root ganglion and intervertebral frame and how that affects it. Yeah, that might be something for the next study to compare the two.
Yeah.
I was just going for 20 to 35 asymptomatic college. So that's a good thought.
As a follow-up to that, did you make anatomical measurements or any kind of categorization of the shape of the lumbar spine or anything?
No, that would be
As to
good.
whether that might help as well, whether some respond and some don't. That's what I'm getting at. Whether you have, structural kind of deficit there in lumbar spine region.
Right. I guess the closest thing to that was just the orthopedic test, just to make sure there's no deformity or malformation. But as far as just the measurements themselves, yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Might be a simple question, but all your subjects were asymptomatic, right? As a chiropractor, if somebody is asymptomatic, do you find that you needed an adjustment? Like when you actually went to do the adjustment, were you able to adjust something even though they were asymptomatic? Or did you find some that they were in line and they didn't need an adjustment when you went to do it?
Well, it's pretty rare for someone to be fully in line, or they don't. And you help pay for that. And that gets into the issue of, muscular imbalances, postural distortions. Anyone aware of the terms upper or lower cross syndrome? A few people are. Well, if you think about postural imbalances, neutral posture, you're upright. If you draw a plumb line ear to shoulder to knee, there should be a straight line. But if you think about everything we do in life, just about everything's in front of us. Instead of here, you're more like this. You're on the computer, you're driving, everything comes forward. So how that affects the low back, if you're constantly in a flexed posture, you spend most of your day sitting or driving. Think about it, glutes get inhibited, hamstrings get tight, hip flexors get tight. And if you can think about how that pulls on the lumbar spine, of course you're going to be out of alignment. Unless someone is walking in an anti-gravity environment, perfect posture, chances are they're going to need adjustment. But as far as adjusting people who are asymptomatic, I guess the term in the profession would be wellness care. So where you come in, I guess they just call it tune-up, just to keep you in line. Some people come in once a month just to get adjusted, to keep everything restored. Again, you're not affecting any kind of pain pathways or anything, but that's more of like a maintenance issue, just as an overall care of your health with nutrition, exercise, and everything else, just keeping everything in line. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the reason I was asking was just if I understood it right, you said some of the studies that you looked at that had some significant findings were working with people that were symptomatic.
Right.
So it goes back to what you said, sort of there's more potential for improvement if they are symptomatic. But I just was curious how that works. If you're not symptomatic, you may need adjustment for actually a sort of a condition if you're not experiencing it.
Yeah. I guess that just goes into, professional athletes, they're generally not symptomatic, so maybe just at that level, the margin of difference, an Olympic athlete, a hundredth of a second is the difference. So if anything you can do to get that edge, that might be just enough to do that. But beyond that, you're not going to see much at less of a level. That's I don't know that for sure, but that's what I would guess.
Just, all right, this is nothing personal in chiropractic. I've got to ask this though, because there's a lot of debate out there in the clinical circles, right, about, you know, getting manipulated regularly and whether that's good in terms of like joint laxity or things like
Right.
that. So what's your professional opinion on athletes regularly getting this, and do you have any scientific literature to kind of back up some of your statements?
Scientific literature, I'd have to get back to you on that, but I guess the term we use in the profession is being hypermobile, being adjusted too much. You know, just like any profession, there's good and bad. You know, some chiropractors get a bad rap. They got you for life. You know, they got a contract where you come in 5 times a week and they adjust you. That's not what anyone learns in school. Every person is their individual case. I mean, someone with an acute sciatica, you're going to work with them more often than someone just for maintenance care once a month. So it is absolutely possible to become hypermobile, to have joint laxity. The only people who would really do that are those more concerned with money than healthcare. But again, every subject is different. You tailor it to what their condition is. And a lot of times people come in, you see them a few times a week, and you kind of taper it off. So, but absolutely that would be a consideration, adjusting too much.
Grant, are there any studies looking at the psychological effects of the adjustments?
If there are, I'm not aware of them.
I mean, because yeah, that could be an avenue of, you know, research. Like, even if it makes them feel better, they're going to perform better,
Yeah.
despite the fact that it doesn't change any strength differences.
Yeah. I mean, just a lot of the people I adjust them, and you know, they get up and say, "Wow, I feel looser, I feel better." I mean, especially the more finely tuned one, you know, the bodybuilder, he got up and instantly it was like, "Wow!" I mean, because he's so in tune with himself, you could tell. And that's the most common things you hear people say: "I feel looser, I feel better." Absolutely, that's just the mental aspect, even more than physiological. That you approach the competition with a better attitude, more relaxed. Absolutely, I should look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. Just to follow up on that one as well. So there were 22 articles, I think you said, that like looked at this, like whether it made an impact or not, and 8 were significantly different. Do you get a feel for like how many of them had a sham control in, or how many had like no control? What I'm getting at is kind of placebo.
Right. Most of them did have a sham, but the one I did was unique to my study. A lot of them, they just did, like, like this is the setup right before the impulse into the segment. A lot of them for a sham would either just kind of hold them there for a while and either just give a fake impulse where it's not on the way to adjust the joint, or just kind of hold it there, or they would do, you know, ultrasound with it detuned, so they think they're getting effect that way. A lot of them did have placebos, but it wasn't what I did. So.
Were the standard error, or were those standard errors or standard deviations?
Standard deviations.
Standard deviations. What's the variability that you would expect without any manipulation? So just day-to-day variability in these kinds of measures.
What do you mean without?
With no manipulation, you know, just what would you typically see in terms of strength testing fluctuations?
Well, again, just that general 5 to 10% is what I keep coming across the literature. The only way I can really explain why these are so huge is, again, just the neurological effect with inhibitory as well as excitatory results. Just the difference in the central nervous system processing. But what I would generally expect in the general population would be much less than that, more along like 5%, as opposed to some of these are way out there like 6 times as much. So much, much less.
Well, Grant, you have to remember that your standard deviations here are not just a function of the adjustment. They're a function that you have a heterogeneous group. So you have a bunch of strong people and you have a bunch of weak people. That's partly why you have this huge standard deviation. Okay?
This is a slightly off topic, but what's your thought on inversion tables?
I actually haven't looked much into that. I'm not sure. Anytime you have decompression, it's generally for nerve root issues or sciatica, but I couldn't honestly tell you. I haven't been trained in that. I'm not sure. Someone else have it?
Yeah, right. It's sort of related to Jody's question, like variability. Did you say that kind of the reliability of the strength testing measurement was about 5 to 10% or so? And then you found like a 4% difference. I was just curious, did you do an a priori power analysis to figure out like what your sample size you would need to find, say, greater than a 5 to 10% change?
Right, for the 5, it was way up there, past 100. I think for like a 10%, it was more around like 40. So, yeah, that's, I mean, I was shooting for 40 just to even go for 10, but in the interest of time.
So in other words, to give yourself a chance of finding that statistical difference,
Right.
you need 100 people or so.
Right, definitely underpowered.
That kind of depends on how big if the adjustment itself made any difference. You're right.
Granted, it seems like, so most of the literature, it sounded like there was a significant improvement with the adjustment, right, with the other studies found. Sounds like your methodology was a little bit stronger than many of them though. And I mean, I can't help but think that I wonder if there's a little publication bias involved there, and they found differences, well, we're gonna accept this one, no difference, well, but I think you've done a number of things that a lot of the studies did do with your randomized control design and stuff like that, and using that monitor, as opposed to some of the other devices that were used. So I don't know, I can't say, but I just wonder if there were some maybe other studies out there that had made it as a print that didn't find anything,
Right.
that would kind of support what you found, but I think the design was strong, so I think that's good.
And part of that variability, I think it's helped by your, percent change, rather than looking at absolute change. And, I mean, you've tried to at least control for part of those factors of variability of subjects, so that's a good addition.
I think what's true in this field is true in a lot of fields when they are so-called emerging fields. The research field in chiropractic is basically in its infantile stage. And what you do is you get people that don't have much experience doing research, and they don't do a very good job of designing their studies and their methodologies. And I think that's when Grant came to me and wanted to be a doctoral student, that's one of the reasons I accepted him, because I thought, well, here's a chance to try to do some good controlled research. And every day I challenge some of Grant's things that he was taught in school. And I don't know whether they're right or wrong, but at least try to make you think about them, okay? To look at them from a different perspective in terms of just accepting everything he's taught, to be a skeptic about it. So you guys know that's kind of the way I am anyway. So.
Definitely a challenge. Great, thank you very much.